Greetings, students. This is Dr. Joseph. Today, we're going to explore the second part of our conversation on the subject of poetry analysis. And our last conversation, part one, I provided some guidelines and some instructions on how to read, uh, how to read or analyze a poem. Um, I discussed some literary techniques the writer or poet uses to convey his intended message. Today, in the second part of our conversation, we're going to explore, we're going to study, we're going to examine an important poem together by James Mercer Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was a prominent writer, poet, social critic, a playwright, also a public intellectual of the Harlem Renaissance. He was born in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. Langston died sometimes in May 22nd in 1967. So what I'm going to try to do in this conversation, we're going to try to actually apply what I have taught you in part one of this conversation. So, for example, we went over some techniques, literary techniques or devices the poet uses in his or her work. And we're going to go over the four major questions when we read a poem. For example, who is the speaker? What is the poet's attitude? What's the setting of the poem? What's the tone of the poem? What's the overall message of the poem? I also mentioned that before you interpret a poem, make sure you read the poem 2 to 3 times. And you want to read the poem line by line and stanza by stanza and try to establish literary connections and literary parallels between the stanzas and the lines, okay, embedded in the poem. The poem we're going to read is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and I'm going to read the poem. Those of you who are taking the Harlem Renaissance course with me, the poem is found on page 257 in your textbook, the Portable Harlem Renaissance Reader. And I will be providing a link so you can follow along with me as I am reading and analyzing the poem. Again, let's read together. The Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers, have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like rivers. Okay. So Langston Hughes wrote this poem, his signature poem, in 1920. But he would publish this poem in 1921 in the Crisis magazine, whose editor was W.E.B. Du Bois. He was an epoch making poem. His father moved to New Mexico. So Langston Hughes was on a train crossing the Mississippi River to St. Louis to his ultimate destination, New Mexico, to visit his father. By the time Langston Hughes was only 18 years old, he was born in 1902, as I mentioned. So he was 18 years old. He did not have any paper handy, but he had an envelope. So he wrote the poem on the back of an envelope as he was contemplating, imagining, okay, as he sat down on the train, passing the Mississippi River, the beautiful sunset, which reflects the amazing uh, nature of the river. At that time, uh, the title of the poem is significant. The Negro speaks of rivers. Now, the title has a main subject, Negro. There's a main verb, speaks, and of course, rivers. So, rivers tells you what the Negro is doing. It's important to note here a poet would sing a poem or would speak speak of poem or recite. In traditional, that's the term that we use, singing, in reference to what a poet does. But in modern times, we would say, recite, speak. That's fine. So the title of the poem tells us exactly the action of the speaker. Speaking. And as we go along, okay, we move to the next line. The subject pronoun I is repeated about 7 times. Each time I is mentioned, it accompanies a series of actions. For example, in the first line, action number 1, I have known rivers. And action number 2 in the second line, I have known. The third action executed by I is I bathed. I bathed in the Euphrates. The next one is I built my hut, my house. The next one is I looked upon the Nile. The next one I heard. And the last mention of I is a repetition. I have known rivers. So this is significant for us to analyze, to understand um, this poem. So the point of view is first person point of view. So the poem is narrated from the perspective of I. Okay, and now how would we describe the attitude of the poet? Well, the attitude of the poet is the poet is very calm. Is very relaxed. Okay, very calm, very relaxed. He's not angry. He's not mad, but there's a sense of joy. There's a sense of delight, and there are images of beauty. Images of death, images of despair, images of suffering or optimism that are conveyed in the embedded lines of this great poem. We're going to look at some of those images together. Um, Also, many places are mentioned in the poem. Let's pay attention. Let's look with me. The first place that is mentioned is Euphrates. The second one is Congo. The next one is Nile. The next one is Mississippi, and the final place is New Orleans. Also, there are many rivers mentioned in this poem. So it's not the poem is not about one single river, but each river conveys a different meaning or multiple meanings. For example, the first river is Euphrates, right? That is mentioned here. And the second one is the Congo River. The third one is the Nile River, perhaps the longest river in the world. And many anthropologists uh, have informed us the Nile is the seat of human civilization. This is where civilization began in Africa. And the next river that is mentioned, of course, is the Mississippi River, which is located in the United States. By contrast, the Nile and Congo are um, located in, excuse me, located in continental Africa, and Euphrates, Middle East, Asia. So this is very important. Different geographical locations are mentioned here. So we have continental Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and North America. Very important locations. So so there's a sense of human migration from one place to another, from one continent to another continent. I also want to bring your attention to the name of a person, Abraham Lincoln, that is mentioned here. Abraham Lincoln is the only person, human, that is mentioned in the poem. But also, although the Negro, where is not mentioned by name, but it's a reference not only to the individual Negro, but to the collective black race. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a little bit here. There are references to nature, many references to nature highlighted in this poem. For example, rivers is a natural phenomenon, isn't it? And there's also the notion of sunset, okay, and the reference to human body, some physical parts, also the human anatomy. The anatomy here, human blood, veins, soul. And Langston uses a literary device to compare and contrast. For example, the little word as and the second line as the world, where he compares the rivers that he has known, I has known to the world, the experience. Now, rivers is very important. I've known rivers. So here, the speaker is talking about different human experiences, multiple experiences. So the river is very significant. It's an important signifier in the poem that conveys different human experiences in different place through different uh, uh, migrating locations. Okay. Also, I want to point out is there's a sense of evolution. There's a sense of evolution. Have known rivers. I bathed. I built. I looked. It seems like the I as a representation of first of the collective of a group. Okay, um, is on a journey, and throughout that journey, I has undergone different experiences, also made different actions. For example, as I mentioned before, I is not a representation of the individual black person. It represents the collective black race, the entire race. Here, I is preconditioned to embrace the whole of the black experience. I is imagined to represent the black diaspora. Also, um, also the African people. So not only I conveys the black diaspora, that means that's a reference to the different locations, different places where people of African descent live. For example, the United States, Brazil, Jamaica, Haiti, the Trinidad, and Mexico, Argentina, and so forth. Now, as we look closely to this poem, this is what we see. The overall message of this poem is this. The message is about the collective experience of the black race. This collective experience entails death, oppression, optimism, and hope. There's a sense of victory. In the first two lines, this is what we see. The experience of the black race is compared to the human blood and human veins. That means it's profound. It is profound as the veins in our body. You know, blood is what sustains life, so this is very important. Um, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. Here, the image of death is important here. You see, blood also signifies death. Um, it's important to note here the image of death in this poem relates first to the transatlantic slavery, where many Africans were taken from their home or were sold into slavery to the so-called the New World. Uh, Many transatlantic uh, historians have estimated about 10 million Africans died on their way to North America, to the American continent. They died in rivers, they died in the oceans, in their way to the New World. Um, River signifies a point of beginning, a point of departure, like one departs from point A to point B or C. River also connotes new beginning. He also signifies death, suffering. He also signifies hope, new beginning, new birth in the poem. So it doesn't mean just one item, one thing. When we move to the next line, I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. Now, Lexington Hughes here is talking about the very beginning of time, the genesis of humanity. In fact, there's a biblical myth that that the first man or the first human beings, Adam and Eve, there's in the Garden of Eden, right? That's where they were, and there were like four rivers. One of the rivers that is mentioned is Euphrates here. So Langston Hughes here refers to the human genesis, to the birth, to the notion of paradise. And the next line, it has to do with the notion of building. Building has to do with achievement, civilization. I built my hut near the Congo. So there's a notion of beauty here. It brings me to sleep like a baby. Okay. Another reference to the notion of building is I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramid above it. Here, Langston Hughes is alluding to the ancient African civilization in the Nile's valley, the ancient Egyptian civilization. How do we know? The reference to Nile and the notion of the pyramids. Here he wants to underscore the achievement of the black race. Remember, this poem was written in 1920 and published in 1921. So at that time, many historians, white racists, were writing pseudo historians about people of African descent, of the black race. In fact, the great German philosopher uh, George Hegel said that continental Africa, produced no history. Many European philosophers and thinkers have excluded the African continent, the black race, and the human narrative and the universal civilization. But here, Langston Hughes is countering those false allegations. Okay, he wants to take us back to the very beginning. He's establishing history, African history. He is countering those false narratives about the African people or the black race. So he's saying that the African people have built the first human civilization. Okay, and a representation of human civilization or African civilization or the African ancient civilization or pre-colonial African civilization is the Nile River, or the pyramids also are significant. They're significant symbols of the great African civilization. Now, Langston Hughes moves from Africa to Mississippi, to the United States, right? The notion of migration here. I heard this singing. So here as the speaker, this I is the speaker in the poem, okay, has witnessed an important event, a historic event, or an historical event that has changed the destiny of the black race in the United States. What is the reference? Well, the reference, if we put together, the notion of singing here has to do with joy, not lamentation, not despair. Okay? If we bring together, if we merge, uh, I heard the singing of the Mississippi and with the action of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the American president who signed the Declaration, okay, to emancipate the slaves in the United States, not only to emancipate the slave legally, but also to stop all transatlantic transactions, okay, of slavery between the United States and other European countries and other African countries. So for the speaker, this was a historic moment of joy for his people. The slaves rejoiced. They rejoiced because of their freedom. So it's important that we highlight here, Lincoln did not give the slaves freedom. The slaves earned, acquired, worked for their own freedom. So at the moment of their emancipation, they sang a new song. And it was a new era, a new beginning in their life. How do we know? Look, golden in the sunset, which refers to a new beginning, a new day, a new era, not only in African American history, but also in the United States history. So overall, this is a great poem which narrates uh, different migrating experiences of the speaker. I mentioned the speaker represent the collective experience of the black race, people of African descent, and those on continental Africa. I hope this was helpful to you. Um, this is Dr. Joseph. Have a great day. Please stay safe.